the dollar amounts for goodwill and non-controlling interest. Okay, so that happened pretty quickly. Would you folks like to spend a couple of minutes? I can pause the recording again and take a couple of minutes to go through. You should be able to, go over the solution, and then maybe if questions come to your mind, you can do that. So sure, I'll just pause the recording one more time, and then when you're ready, maybe just post your questions, or a few minutes time, I can resume recording, and then we can take it up. Okay, so take a few minutes, please. And I want to move on to a tiny little detail here that sometimes we'll come across negative acquisition differential. And you just need to remember that a negative acquisition differential does not mean automatically that there's negative goodwill. You know that negative goodwill is recognized immediately as a gain on acquisition. So just to remind us of that little fact, I have a couple of very short little examples here, example 6.5 and 6.6. So in 6.5, there is negative acquisition differential and there's negative goodwill. If there's negative goodwill, it's recognized immediately as a gain on acquisition. So over here, Paul Corp purchased the outstanding common shares of Martin for $2 million. On that date, Martin had common shares $1 million, retained earnings 1.5 mil. So Paul Corp purchased all of the outstanding common shares. There's no non-controlling interest in this particular situation, and they paid $2 million for that purpose. The net book value of Martin Inc. at that time was 1 million in common shares and 1.5 million in retained earnings. So that works out to 2.5 mil. The math is fairly easy, 2.5 mil. So if I subtract the net book value from acquisition cost, I get acquisition differential of negative 500,000. So if you come across negative acquisition differential, please do not interpret that to mean that there is negative goodwill right away. You should still allocate the acquisition differential to fair value differences. So what happened in this case was that the book values of Martin Inc.'s assets and liabilities were equal to their fair values, except for inventory, equipment, and bonds payable having different book values and fair values. The inventory had a book value that was more than the fair value. So overstated inventory is an asset. Overstated assets result in negative fair value differences. Equipment was also overstated by 150,000. Bonds payable liability was also overstated. Now, in the case of liabilities, remember, the difference is actually a positive. So everything added together, we get total fair value difference of negative 100,000. Now, if I subtract the negative 100,000 from the acquisition differential, so negative 500,000 minus a negative 100,000. Remember, minus of a minus turns into a plus. So you'll be left with 400,000 negative. That 400,000 negative is a negative goodwill. But remember, we don't leave goodwill with a negative value. Negative goodwill is immediately recognized as a gain on acquisition. So we recognize $400,000 as a gain on acquisition. So if you ever had a multiple choice question that gave you these facts and the question asks, what's the goodwill value? The correct answer is 0. Okay? Because there can't be any negative goodwill. If you see negative goodwill, it's recognized immediately as a gain on acquisition. So the correct answer in that question would be goodwill is 0. So in this particular example, 6.5, goodwill was 0. Why? Because we ended up with negative goodwill, which was recognized immediately as a gain on acquisition. Okay, is that good? All right. Now, if I change that slightly, if I say, well, refer to these facts and assume that there's an unrecorded liability of 500,000 related to ongoing litigation faced by Martin. So if we redid the calculation, we'll have the acquisition cost, net book value, negative acquisition differential, right? And then we've got bonds payable with a, well, overstated liability. So that was a positive. And there is this additional unrecorded litigation liability. So the litigation liability is unrecorded, which means it's understated, 500,000. That's going to result in a negative fair value difference of 500,000. The total fair value difference in this case works out to negative 600,000. Now, if I subtract negative 600,000 from the acquisition differential, negative 500,000, because minus of a minus becomes a plus, I'm going to end up with positive 100,000. That positive 100,000 is actually the goodwill. So in this scenario, we actually, even with the fact that there was negative acquisition differential, we end up with positive goodwill. Okay, and the reason for that is that the fair value differences were an even bigger negative than the acquisition differential. So when I allocated the acquisition differential, negative 500,000, when I allocated to the fair value differences, and I found the fair value differences were a bigger negative number, like a negative 600,000, I'm left with goodwill of $100,000. All right, so this is all arithmetic. So you should not get into your heads that the moment I see there's negative acquisition differential, it's going to mean negative goodwill or therefore a gain on acquisition. No, no, no. Okay. If there is negative goodwill, yes, it will be recorded as gain on acquisition, but you don't jump to that conclusion. You must first investigate thoroughly and allocate the acquisition differential to the fair value differences of all identified assets and liabilities.